So, I'm guessing it's that title that brought you here. It's not your usual title. I've been thinking a lot about civics education in the last few years, and I formerly was in the American Heritage rotation. I've had to leave that rotation because of schedule conflicts in the last couple of years. But during the time that I was, and since, I thought a lot about how students learn about their kind of responsibilities and benefits as a citizen, and how they process the news that comes to them frequently in increasingly problematic ways. And so I've been trying to figure out, how do I engage with this? And I came to a conclusion that I felt like what my students needed the most was informed citizenship, meaning they need to know what they're talking about. So we need to figure out how to help them get educated in that. And civility, learning how to engage with people on a different side of the political spectrum in a useful way, which probably involves more listening than talking. And not just demonizing the other side. So that's kind of a background to what I'm talking about here. 3 ways I wanted to talk about today to help students navigate our polarized world. And the first 2 I'm just going to really kind of touch on, kind of briefly. I'm going to spend most of the time on the last. So the first one is historical context, helping them understand how we got where we are and where we might be going. Second, encouragement of civil discourse, not just discourse within our polity, but discourse that is civil and civilized. And then finally, information literacy, or you could also call it digital literacy. It's been called that a lot in various universities, recognizing the fact that so much of our information now comes over the internet and isn't curated, you might say, in the same way that information, especially in terms of current events, was curated in the past. So, back to that title. It comes from a campaign song when John Quincy Adams was running for president. And these are some of the words in that song, and I'll just play it for you while you read it. At least I think I will. Funny how you get things to work before, and then when the time comes, they don't. There we go.
If John Quincy not be coming, tears are coming, plague and pestilence are coming, pain is coming, Satan is coming. If John Quincy not be coming. Wow.
Okay. So pretty apocalyptic, isn't it? So I'm talking about historical context here. One of the things that I think we need to help students understand is that this really divisive moment that we're in is not the first and maybe not the worst that we've been in as a country. That it's pretty bad, but it will likely get better at some point, just like this really bad period got better. And a little historical context on that. This was in the early 19th century, and during that era, at least especially a little bit earlier than this time period, newspapers were party organs. So they were not independent documents that were trying to get something from each side. They weren't trying to put information out there. They were founded by parties and were intended to forward the thinking of a party. And so people heard lots of really extreme things in print from each of the parties representing these various organs. And it led to a lot of really violent and hostile interactions in politics. Now, since that time period, we had the development of journalism as a professional discipline. And the whole idea of journalism was that it would create as objective a treatment of the news as possible. Of course, we know that that's not fully possible. But the idea was to try to present things from both sides. We're in a different moment now. We've moved kind of beyond that phase. And much of the news and information that we get is no longer coming through people who are trained in the professional standards of journalism, but from people, again, kind of like in this era, who are representing a partisan position. And all of that is complicated by the challenge of the internet, where it becomes really hard to figure out where that information is coming from. So I think if you give students this context, that they may no longer be able to trust everything that they read. I mean, actually, you've never been able to trust everything that you read, but it's gotten a little worse lately. And that they need to understand that this has happened before, and that things changed, and things are changing now, but they can change again. I'm in this GE work design committee this year, and one of the things that I've heard that has really stuck with me was something that John Rosenberg, the academic vice president, mentioned, and that was that he felt like we should keep in our minds that when we interact with students, whether in the classroom or in one-on-one mentoring or when they come to us for advisement, we should try to ensure as much as possible that when they leave us, they feel hopeful, informed, valued, and engaged. So hopeful, informed, valued, and engaged. I think one of the reasons why it's important to give students historical context is so that they can remain hopeful, so that they can be aware that things change, things ebb and flow. It's really easy when you are confronted with some of the divisive political rhetoric that we're hearing now to think the end is here. You know, it's not getting better. What I need to do is just disengage. Go live in a hut in Saskatchewan and just not be part of the body politic. And that's not what we want them to feel. We want them to feel informed and hopeful, valued as a person for whatever attitudes they may bring, and engaged in the sense that they can do something. They're not just doomed to being acted upon. They can make change. So, the other point, second point I wanted to make was encouraging civil discourse. And I was going to include a clip, but I decided not to. But I just want to mention appeal to authority. A number of our church leaders and speakers here at the university recently have spoken on the need for more civil dialogue. And if students get to know you and trust you well, they may take it from you, but you might as well appeal to other people that they trust as well. And maybe play a clip from one of Dallin Oak's speeches where he talks about the necessity for civil discourse. Or other speakers who have come to campus. Put it out there and say, it's not just me, who you may suspect of being maybe on the wrong side of the political divide. It's also church leaders who are saying we need to respect people on both sides. Yeah.
And I find if your students are coding you politically one way, it's always good to have a black person, a white person, or a woman and a man, somebody who's an over Republican, over Democrat.
Yeah.
So always do it from both and let them know and be sincere, right?
Yeah.
They endorse both.
That's a really great idea.
To do that.
Yeah. The second one I was going to mention was assignments, and I'm going to actually elaborate on that a little bit later in this presentation. But just on that subject of being civil, this comes from Elder Oaks conference talk in October 2014, and he gave a version of this, slightly different version of this, as a BYU devotional in 2016 as well. And of course, they're available online. But he says, on the subject of public discourse, we should all follow the gospel teachings to love our neighbor and avoid contention. Followers of Christ should be examples of civility. We should love all people, be good listeners, which is something I think we really need to stress, and show concern for their sincere beliefs. Though we may disagree, we should not be disagreeable, and so on. So there are examples of these kinds of statements by trusted authorities that could help students come around to this not being just a political message, but a message that's deeply connected to their deepest values as well. So finally, my third point, information literacy or digital literacy. So first off, as an American Heritage teacher, I used iClickers, and every time we had a class, I gave them some kind of a quiz. So over the course of the semester, I accumulated quite a bit of interesting information about where students stand on the political spectrum. Now, I should add a caveat, which is, I don't know that they really know where they stand. They have some kind of knee-jerk reactions, I think, that they get from growing up. And then when you ask them a really specific question, sometimes they'll respond in a way that is completely inconsistent with those other reactions. So they're obviously learning. They're not really sure where they are. And so it can be helpful to talk to them about these things. But I asked them where they get their news. And this is the response. Social media, 30%. Traditional news programs that are kind of curated by professional journalists, 5%. Talk shows, and I'm talking about things like The Daily Show, Seth Meyers, those kinds of things, 47%. Newspapers, 8%. Other, 10%. Not sure what other consists of. But I tried to break some of these down, like newspapers, I said, news aggregators, those kinds of things, still 8%. So they're getting very little of their news information from what we would consider trusted sources that are at least aiming for some kind of objectivity. They get most of it from sources that are fairly polarized. And perhaps the most polarized of those is social media. So what's the problem with getting your news from social media? One is the algorithm. The algorithm is designed to feed you more of what you like. It is not designed to expose you to a range of different ideas or perspectives on today's issues. It's trying to steer you towards the extreme. And that's just the way it works. It's beneficial for marketing purposes to have it that way, I suppose. They could change it if they wanted, but they don't want to yet. So you tend to get steered toward things that you already believe. Your friends are likely to share your opinions, and people who don't share your opinions, you either often unfriend or they never were your friends in the first place. And this magnifies what some people call the digital echo chamber effect, that you just hear more and more reinforcement of what you already think. And in fact, not just reinforcement, but pushing you towards the extreme. So you may have seen this one before. So another problem is so much that you find on the internet is actually not true. It's misattributed, or it's not attributed at all, or it's just plain out false. And students are not always good at telling what is true and what isn't. Actually, they're very rarely good at telling those things. So what kind of resources can we use to try to help students figure these things out better? I've listed a few of them, but there's actually a whole raft of them out there. This second one, the AACU, so I think it's the Association of American Colleges and Universities. They put together a national task force on civic learning and democratic engagement in 2012. And I forgot to include my link. I will put it up there later. But if you search for this, it will probably come up. It's a fat, like 70, 80 page report on this task force, outlining the reasons why they felt it was necessary to put together a task force, looking at what can be done about the problem, giving a number of examples of different universities who have put together civics education programs, how they've tried to integrate it into their curricula, all kinds of really good information. Stanford History Education Group, through the Education School at Stanford, has also been pushing this idea. They have a program called Civic Online Reasoning, where they're specifically addressing the problem of the difficulty of figuring out what's true and what isn't on the internet. And so they actually have a curriculum online. They call it CORE, the Civic Online Reasoning Curriculum. And if you log into it and register, that's what they ask you to do, is register, you have access for free to all of their curriculum. And it's actually really interesting and useful. This third one that I've listed, it's an article. But I think it's useful for its kind of common sense approach. One of the things that it says is you can tell students that when they hear information, if they have a strong emotional response to it, if they feel like, oh, I've got to share this, or I've got to tag this or whatever, it's probably information that you shouldn't trust. It's probably designed in such a way to stoke your passions rather than to engage your reasoning faculties. And that's what we get a lot on the internet. So it gives some good advice like that. But each of these are some good sources, but there are many others. There's one, in fact, out there that was founded by Sandra Day O'Connor, a civics education kind of foundation that puts stuff out there for younger students than our students. The Stanford History Education Group puts them out for a wide range of students, college, middle school, high school. So let's go back to this, the AACU's task force. This I thought was useful to see the way that they're thinking. It's a framework for civic learning and democratic engagement that looks at three kind of big categories, well, four: knowledge, skills, values, and collective action. And I thought skills in particular was interesting because this is clearly not just history education. This is education that really should be incorporated across the curriculum. So critical inquiry, analysis and reasoning, quantitative reasoning, not just kind of social science and literature kind of thinking, but quantitative reasoning is also important. Gathering and evaluating multiple sources of evidence, seeking, engaging, and being informed by multiple perspectives, written, oral, and multimedia communication, deliberation and bridge building across differences, collaborative decision-making, and the ability to communicate in multiple languages. And I'm not sure if they're talking about languages like Spanish and French or the languages of disciplines and those kinds of things as well. So those are really GE objectives, skills that we want our students to acquire as undergraduates. And they also track really well with the kind of objectives that we hear from employers. We, as college professors, don't have to be convinced that giving students a liberal education is valuable. Sometimes parents and employers are not as interested in that, but they tend, when you ask them, to actually have the same objectives. They want employees who can think critically, who can communicate effectively, who can work in teams, who can bridge divides. These are all important skills. So I want to show you some examples of the work that the Stanford History Education Group has done. Some of the materials that they use to try to assess the online reasoning ability of students and figure out how well they're able to reason and ways to help them reason and track information better. So this is an example of an actual post online. Shows this image. Not much more to say. This is what happens when flowers get nuclear birth defects. Okay. And then they present this post to students. I think this was presented to high school students. And then they ask, does this post provide strong evidence about the conditions near the Fukushima Daiichi power plant? Explain your reasoning. Okay, let's see how well you do. Okay, how do we know that these are from Fukushima?
You don't know.
Well, it says Fukushima nuclear flowers, right?
It could be Photoshopped.
Could be photoshopped, yeah. All right, so if you
Small sample size.
yes, if you feel a little suspicious about this, how might you check it? What would you do?
Google image search and see what other images come up for, or like what other references come up.
Yeah, you can do an image search and find out maybe what the origin of this reference of this image was. Yes?
Yeah, I just Google it and find out other reputable sources that talk about this.
Yeah? Jay?
Try to find out who created the website, who was behind it.
Yeah? Good.
Or who please Google Shaker or please Google Kelly is.
Yes, yes. Who is that person? Bruce?
You can check with DOE, Department of Energy, and see if they have any reports or findings of that area, which they should have some.
So maybe do some research into the actual claim. Yeah. So one is source checking. The other one is, kind of parallel research, trying to confirm whether or not this is true. So I showed this to my students this year in my History 220 class. So they're supposed to be freshmen and sophomores. There's a few seniors in there. They did very poorly. I was really kind of alarmed. The kinds of strategies they had to try to figure out if this was true or not. Many of them just accepted it on the face of it and said, yeah, this is so terrible. And certainly it's a terrible thing that the disaster occurred, but it's problematic how they look at it. Here's another example. All right. So 2 questions that the Stanford...
How many of your students just accepted it at face value?
I'm only basing it on the comments that I got. I didn't actually quiz them on it. But based on the comments, it seemed like a third to a half of them just kind of accepted it. We had a long discussion, probably 20 minutes on it. All right, so here's another example. This is just a Twitter link. Lots of students get their news from Twitter. Why might this tweet be a useful source about NRA members' opinions on background checks? List any sources you use to make your decision, and then the opposite. Why might it not be a useful source? Okay, so let's see again. How would you answer this question?
It's from move on.
Yeah, it's from
it's
move on.
motivated by a particular political perspective.
Okay, now you knew that. My students didn't.
Really?
They had not heard of Move On. In fact, I don't think a single student, at least that made a comment, knew what Move On was. And so they weren't aware that there might have been a particular political perspective in this tweet. So, yeah, they didn't know how to kind of take this apart. There's kind of a second half to it.
The link has 666 in it, so say it's clearly a comment.
That would have been a great comment. Okay. So here's another example, a little bit more information than just a Twitter string. So new polling shows that the NRA is out of touch with gun owners and their own members. And then it's got a Twitter, what do you call that, string, an image. And then again, I asked, okay, is this reliable? Who do you think created this?
Well, they certainly didn't know that Center for American Progress from CAP, right?
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not.
Which is a left-leaning think tank.
Yeah. And it probably would be useful if you're doing this kind of exercise to have examples from the left and the right. But I'm trying to get them to grab the idea that every source has an author. Every source has an audience. Every source has a purpose. What are those audiences, authors, purposes here? And they're not used to thinking that way. So, critical thinking. And I mentioned some of those ideas again. Ask questions. One thing I try to tell students, as we go through the semester, I have them respond to primary documents that they read in their books, but also sometimes to primary documents that are not in words, like a painting, for instance. I say, what is the argument of this painting? And at first they're like, but everything has an argument. Every bit of information that is presented has an inherent perspective. People are trying to get you to think something, to be positively influenced by something or negatively influenced by something. And so these are the kind of questions that can help them think about that. What is the source of the information? So let's imagine that it's a painting. What is the source of the information?
The artist.
It's the artist. So you might need to know something about that artist. You know, when did they, where were they born? When? What kinds of other paintings did they do? Were they engaged in any kind of political causes? I mean, what can you find out about that author? Is the source biased? Another way to ask that might be, you know, who is the audience for this? Are they trying to reach a particular audience or sway people to a particular perspective? What evidence do they offer for their story? Now, if you're just looking at a traditional news story, you read through the story, it's not going to have footnotes, but usually it will say, Professor Green of, you know, BYU says, you know, so they'll cite sources. In a painting, it's the details that they choose. So students have to grapple with the fact that everything has a selection bias. The details that you choose to include in your painting or in your advertisement or in your editorial reflect your purpose in creating that document or that painting, what you're trying to sway people to. And that's the evidence. You know, it's either the details or the authorities that you cite, those kinds of things. What was their purpose in creating the story? So I showed my students these questions and then asked them to take a look at those images again. Ask those questions, see if they could figure things out. And they have the tools on them. They've all got their phones with them. They can start, you know, figuring out what MoveOn.org is, or finding out what they can about the author of a certain statement. So they can figure out how to do that searching. The article that I showed you that I said has kind of common sense approaches to information literacy talks about some basic skills that students should develop, especially in dealing with internet information. And those include lateral searching. So you move from one website over to another to check and double check and find out as much information as you can about a claim. Trying to go down the link to figure out who created the information, because often the information that gets posted is 8 generations back or so before you can figure out actually who created it and whether it's being used in the same way that it was originally created for. So critical thinking skills. How do you get students to think carefully about the information they have? Now I just want to show you some sample assignments and ask for your feedback about how you're getting your students to do this same kind of thinking. So I included just 2 examples. Excuse me. One is reading on the other side of the partisan divide. This is an assignment that I gave my students for a couple of years in American Heritage. Basically what I did is I said, I want you to try to figure out where you stand on the partisan divide, and a lot of them don't know. And then choose a commentator. So I didn't say choose a news writer, but a commentator, so like someone who writes editorials. And read something that they write every week and write a paragraph response to it.
I've heard students report back about this.
What did they say?
They read David Brooks or somebody and they
Yeah.
talked about what they learned from it. It seemed positive.
Good, good. When I read through my student comments at the end of the semester, my overall impression was students found it hard. They didn't necessarily like it, but at the end of the day, they thought it was valuable. So, and then the second one, a digital dialogue assignment that I'm doing right now. So I'm going to show you kind of an example of how each one works. This is really small. You don't have to read the whole thing, but this is what I put in my syllabus for my American Heritage students. First off, I gave them my reasoning, which was basically, I want you to be more informed about current affairs and learn how to critically evaluate information. And then I talked to them about what I just said to you about how the internet tends to create these digital echo chambers, which is problematic. So you need to actually take action to be able to get a different perspective. I was complaining about the way that, it funnels you into what you already might think. And my dad actually pointed me to a website. I haven't found it great, but it's okay. And it's called Real Clear Politics. Has anyone been there? Which tends to give you extremes on both sides, and some moderate opinions, but at least you can get both sides. So that's one place to direct students to. So I present the problem, and then I tell them what they need to do. I assign them to select a reasonable political commentator. Now, as I got into the nuts and bolts of this assignment, I realized I was going to have to give them a list of people that I considered reasonable, because there's so much vitriol out there. And basically I said, okay, if this commentator is engaging in name calling, if they're just saying this is a horrible person, Satan's coming, then I didn't want them on the list. I wanted someone who was reasonable on each side. So I actually got on Facebook and asked a bunch of people, give me the names of people who you think are reasonable. And then I would go and read them. And anyway, I made up a list of conservative and liberal commentators who I thought were actually trying to communicate and be rational, and gave that list to students and then had them choose. And then what they had to do was either listen to, so I allowed for radio commentators, that kind of thing, or read something that person had done each week and then write a paragraph responding to it, saying how that commentary had influenced their own thinking on an issue, and then bring it to the lab. Now, these were not graded assignments. It can be challenging to grade partisan kind of writing, and I wanted students to feel free to respond honestly. So basically it was participation. We had a pretty high participation grade. It was like 20% or something, really high. And they had to do this, I believe 12 weeks over the course of the semester. So, I'm asking quite a bit of them. And so basically they're graded on whether they turned it in, whether it looks like they took the assignment seriously, but not on what they said. They had to basically turn it in this format: their name, the name of the commentator, the citation, and how it influenced their thinking. So basically kind of a citation at the top and then their paragraph below. I also gave them the information, because students don't know this either, that they can get access to this free at BYU. They don't know that. They don't know that they can go to the library website and read the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post without having to get a subscription. So you have to tell them that. Or tell them that you can pick up a New York Times free just by walking by several different buildings on campus. So again, access to information, students have to be kind of shown the way. Have any of you tried anything similar to this in your classes? Yes.
So we actually start, so I'm teaching intro psychology, the science of psychology, but the first week we talk about what is truth. I have them read an article on how fake news spreads faster.
Yes.
And I show them an article, an example of a Facebook post from a PhD colleague of mine at this university who got something all wrong about starfish dying off in Oregon, and how I saw that on Facebook. I'm like, but then I went and looked it up and like, oh, that's not actually true. She got that all wrong.
Yeah.
So I start them thinking, and then they have to visit. I like this idea, but I give them a list of stuff going on all over campus, and they have to go to 3 different civic engagement talks or stuff at the Kennedy Center, just anywhere on campus, history forums. I mean, they have to do 3 of these and write about them in the course of the semester.
That's great. And you've probably noticed this, but this year the forums have been thematically linked, and they're all about engaging as a good citizen in a democracy. That's really useful. So I made it mandatory for my students to attend at least one of those forums, and then they could get extra credit out of my 1,000 points possible in the class. I gave them 5 points if they would. You wouldn't believe how many people took me up on it. If they would attend some additional ones. So yeah, making them aware that these things exist, or assigning them to go to them.
Just Google spreadsheet. So anytime I learn about something, or TA learns about something, we just put on. So they have a list of stuff going on campus.
That's great. You know, I think that there's been just from talking to people, there seems to be kind of 2 ways to look at how you get students involved in going to and processing the many wonderful opportunities we provide them at this university. And one is kind of the free agency one. You know, they need to make their own decisions. They need to choose how they want to spend their time. And then there's Satan's plan. It's that I will force them to do what's right. I'm afraid I'd lean a little more towards Satan's plan. I think there's so many students who will not take the opportunity unless you provide some kind of incentive. And then they can choose to take or not take that incentive. They just don't know what they're missing. So worth thinking about. Okay, let me show you the other example. And this is one I'm doing in my 220 class this semester. 220 is the first half of American history. And I was trying to think of a way to get them to do group work in a class with 70 students that would be meaningful. And I had tried kind of group presentations the previous semester, and I just really felt like it was kind of a waste of time. And so I came up with this idea, and I've been happier with it. And that is, I put 10 different questions on Digital Dialogue and then asked them to sign up for one of the questions. And it's kind of complex the way I structured it. So each student signs up for just one. It's part of their participation grade, but they sign up for one of those discussions, and once they've signed up, they are supposed to make an initial response. Once they make their initial response, then they can read everyone else's responses. And then they have to do 2 more responses. One of them engages the second half of the question, which I've linked to kind of current events. And then the third one is responding to other students who are part of the conversation. So as an example, here's one of the questions, and it's connected to what they've been reading. So they read the farewell address, and in it, Washington said, "Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government." And then I ask, why were George Washington and the founders so wary of foreign influence, and what might they make of the current impeachment process? Which is, of course, connected to that idea with Ukraine and foreign influence. So their job is to respond to the first question drawing on the reading. So I wanted them to engage with answering a question that was evidence-based. So they have to draw on the readings. And it's not just George Washington, there were a number of other readings that they had to read as well. And after they make that initial response, I want them to respond to the second half. And we talked in class about the fact that they might need to actually do a little bit of research to figure out what is going on currently and how it relates to what they've been reading about in terms of history. So for instance, the first week, I was talking about how Native Americans responded to a particular issue, and then the second half was, how might this relate to the Dakota Access Pipeline issue? And nobody knew what that was. And so I said, okay, how are you going to find out about it? And then we pulled up Google and Googled it and said, okay, which of these websites could you trust? What are their perspectives? Who created them? And, of course, there were websites from Native groups, and there were websites from conservative political organizations. And I said, you can go ahead and read those. They're a perspective, they're valid perspectives. You just need to be aware who wrote it, what their bias is, what their purpose is in creating the website, and then try to find some that are actually engaging on both sides and trying to evaluate the information. And then hopefully you'll be prepared to answer this question. So when they have to go out and find out about something, hopefully they've been prepared with the tools that they need to be able to assess whether the information they're reading is valid or not. Or if it represents a particular point of view, good. What's the other point of view? What are the other point of views that they might want to get access to? All right, so they need to respond to the second question, and then they also need to respond to other students. So I said, comments might be in the form of additional evidence or polite agreement or disagreement, stating your reasons for agreeing or disagreeing. This is not meant to be a fight, but an opportunity to share evidence and opinions and learn from each other's insights. So I tried to kind of prepare them. I mean, students, I think, are inclined to be polite, but I also want them to engage with each other, and that's sometimes harder. So I thought I'd give you some examples of some of their, oh my gosh, time is flying, of their responsive. Okay. So this is the George Washington one. So one student said, he thinks that the reason they were wary of foreign influence is because they were Protestant, they were trying to separate themselves from religious persecutions. For instance, we have the account of John Winthrop, who spoke of creating a city on the hill. So he's citing evidence. That was one of the documents that he had read earlier. Someone else responds, I agree that colonial background and religion had a large part. However, I think the loss of power in most colonies that led to the Revolutionary War by a foreign power also had a lot of effect on them, and if they wanted to keep their freedom, they couldn't let the past repeat itself. So they're reasoning. And now they're starting to engage with the second half. George Washington's wariness of foreign influence seems obvious in light of the causes of the revolution. They fought against lack of representation. Mary Smith Cranch's letters to her sister show how the average American citizens paid attention to politics and made it personal. With a nation built on government for the citizens, the idea of foreign influence in the government would seem abhorrent. Then the last person says, I agree with you on that. It seems that people really sought for what they felt to be right, rather than let national or even colonial ties get in the way. As we discussed in class last week, Mitt Romney's vote against Trump in the impeachment trial reflects that, as he felt that following his beliefs was more important than his political alignment. So they're trying to pull together the past evidence, things that they read, responding to the question about the impeachment trial and how it worked out, and expressing each other's ideas. There were some very thoughtful responses on here, and of course I didn't include all of them. Some of them were kind of on the liberal side, and some of them were very conservative. But there was no nastiness. which I was glad for. No name calling or questioning the other person's value as a human being, which sometimes you see online.
How large is the class?
70. It's a lot of students. I do a lot of discussion in class, and I don't know if that has influenced their ability to discuss here. I hope so. Darren?
Yeah, I'm sorry, this might be a little farther afield, but I'm wondering, so I believe that we can help students with these skills. I think there's even a larger problem, which is what happens when they encounter people in our society who do not have these skills. Have you thought about that at all, how to help them deal with that situation? Because that's a situation that I face constantly. And I'm afraid that I choose to mostly disengage, but I wonder if that's the right thing, right? I mean, is there a way to interact with other people in the society who do not have these skills? That seems to me like
It's a very good question.
Civic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, developing the skills is one thing. But,
Yeah. I have, when I was teaching American Heritage, I did show them some examples of discussions, online discussions, where it quickly devolved into that. Where, one person's comment was, I have now ceased to consider you a human being.
Right.
And how do you
deal
with that?
Yeah.
And we did talk about it a little bit. I haven't done it in this current class, but it's a good question. And sometimes you just have to say, well, I can see that you feel very strongly about this, and I disagree, but I respect your right to believe that.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing. There was a hand over here.
Yeah, we do that, and we tell people to get curious and ask them. They say something offensive. You get curious. Well, why is it you hold that belief? Where does that come from? What does racist mean to you? Go on down the line and help them.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a pattern of practice. Research shows that young moms delete Facebook from their phone more than other people because they're comparing to others and child rearing. They feel not perfect.
Yeah.
The students of color at BYU are a lot more likely to just lock their account, go off social media.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about the distribution of that burden, of engaging with those who deny your humanity.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah.
And we kind of honed in on, if you have privilege and you have people in your family and in your sphere and in your circle, you really need to hold yourself accountable to be working with them to help them.
Yeah.
To at least engage in a civil way.
Yeah.
You can't put that all on the marginalized
Yes.
to do that work.
Yeah.
Oh, and I wish I would have
So
included
unfair.
this, but there was a wonderful talk given at the Maxwell Institute by a woman who is the daughter of Desmond Tutu. Were you there?
No, but I've heard about it.
And she made some statements that I showed to my class last semester, and I plan to show them to the class this semester, where she made that exact argument, that it can't always be the job of the traditionally oppressed figures in society to police other people's speech or to respond in a positive way when they get offended, that we need to take some of that on as well. And I think one good thing to maybe think about is the problem of trigger words, you might say. So there are certain words that if you say them, you can guarantee that the conversation will not go well. So Hitler, racist, those kinds of words, it puts people's defenses up. So you need to figure out what those words are and find synonyms that will allow you to have the conversation, but that won't close the door.
Current president of the United States.
Yeah.
But I do worry about people, like minority people in the class who could be victimized by others in this. I guess it's not anonymous, right?
Yeah, it's not.
It's not anonymous, so people still have responsibility. But like the problem I find in classes is I teach, I might have 40 students and there's one person of color, and then we're talking about racial diversity,
Yeah.
right? And I feel some responsibility to sort of not protect, but
Structure and ways.
yeah, like structure fences around this person having to be the voice for their race or their
Yeah.
gender or whatever. And I think that in class I feel more confident doing that, but I'd be curious about how you do that with an online dialogue, if that's ever come up for you.
I've been, reading along as they've been posting, and so far I haven't seen anything that has worried me. But I know that we've had things in the college in this semester where things have gone wrong. Digital dialogue is protected from that. I mean, you do have to be a student in the class to be able to participate. So that's one way that you can protect them. Another way is just, I think, like we tell parents, you know, be in the same room with your kids when they're watching television. Or, I have to keep reading, and at some point I might need to step in if something went awry.
We have a couple assignments in answer to your question where we have them watch or do something with somebody outside the class, and then we have them explain, using the skills that we've given them, why that person's reaction was different, how they've learned a different knowledge base that requires some of these skills, to get them to get outside themselves with that problem that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's been helpful.
Sure. So a little bit of perspective taking. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know,
That's context.
It's a hard problem. Yeah, it's a hard problem.
It is.
We got to finish up. I don't know if
Yeah.
you quick, Bruce, but
So I was just wondering, are you going to follow up on these 70 students in a couple of semesters, see if they're still using the skills? But even after that, after they graduate as alumni, just follow up and say, do you still have the skills, or have you improved them? Are you using them, or has it all been forgotten after the final exam?
That's it.
It's a good question. I don't know that I'm going to follow up, but I might suggest to the alumni questionnaire people that they think about that.
thanks, Jenny.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Johnny.